Here is a fact that almost no one talks about. The story of Atlantis, the most searched lost city in human history, the subject of more books than any archaeological site on Earth, the legend that has consumed explorers, philosophers, kings, and conspiracy theorists for over 2,000 years, was written by one man. One man. A Greek philosopher named Plato in 360 BC in 2 dialogues he never even finished. That's it. That is the entire primary source. No Egyptian papyrus, no Phoenician sea chart, no carved stone tablet dug from volcanic ash. One man, one incomplete text, written roughly 9,000 years after the events it describes, according to the story's own timeline. Here is the part that keeps historians awake. Plato was the greatest liar in the ancient world, not because he was dishonest, because he was brilliant. He routinely put invented speeches into the mouths of real people. He built entire philosophical worlds out of stories he openly called myths. He once wrote a famous allegory about prisoners in a cave watching shadows and expected his readers to understand it wasn't a real cave. And yet, when his character Critias tells the story of Atlantis, he says 3 times, 3 separate times in the text, that it is not a myth, that it is true, that it happened, that the records survive in Egypt and can be verified. So, which was it? A moral fable dressed in geography, or a real city swallowed by the sea? The answer, when you actually dig into it, is stranger than either option. Because there was a civilization destroyed by a volcanic catastrophe so violent it may have ended the Bronze Age. Indeed, there was a Bronze Age culture that built concentric harbors and worshipped bulls in ritual ceremonies. There were Egyptian temple records written in a script that couldn't be read by Greeks. And there was a city, well within Plato's lifetime, that sank into the sea in a single night, and which Plato almost certainly knew about personally. He may have been writing about all of them at once, or none of them. Tonight, we are going to follow the evidence, not the legend, not the fantasy, not the 19th century pseudoscience, the actual evidence. The volcanic ash cores, the ocean floor maps, the excavated ruins, the calendar contradictions that even Plato's own followers couldn't explain. And by the end, you will understand why the story of Atlantis says something true about every powerful civilization that has ever existed, including the ones that are standing right now. Let's start at the beginning, the real beginning. The year is 360 BC. Athens is arguing. Athens is always arguing. That is, in many ways, the point of Athens. But in 360 BC, the argument has a specific and painful edge. The city that had defeated Persia at Marathon, that had built the Parthenon, that had given the world democracy and tragedy and philosophy, has just finished losing a catastrophic war against Sparta. The 30 tyrants have come and gone. The trial and execution of Socrates is a living wound, only 40 years old. Athens is trying to figure out what it got wrong. Into this moment walks Plato. He is 67 years old. He has already written the Republic, in which he describes the ideal city-state. He has already founded the Academy, the first institution in the Western world that we would recognize as a university. He has been writing philosophy for 4 decades. And now, in 2 dialogues called Timaeus and Critias, he introduces a story that no one has ever mentioned before. Not Homer, not Herodotus, not any surviving Greek text before this moment. A great island civilization in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, larger than Libya and Asia combined, according to Critias. Founded by the sea god Poseidon. Rich in a mysterious red metal called orichalcum, governed by 10 kings who were direct descendants of the god. Home to a ringed harbour of breathtaking engineering, concentric circles of land and water connected by bridges with a canal to the sea. A city, he says, that attacked Greece 9,000 years before his own time. A city that was stopped only by the heroic resistance of a prehistoric Athens, and then destroyed, in a single day and night, by earthquakes and floods sent by the gods as punishment for the city's moral corruption. The water, he says, closed over it, and it was never seen again. Now, Here is what scholars have been arguing about for 2,380 years. Did Plato invent this, or did he inherit it? His character Critias says it quite specifically. Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver who died around 560 BC, roughly 200 years before Plato was writing, traveled to Egypt in his old age. In the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, he was received by Egyptian priests at the temple of Neith, a goddess the Greeks identified with Athena. An old priest, Critias says, told Solon about the Atlantic civilization. The priest said the Egyptians had kept records going back tens of thousands of years, records that the Greeks lacked because Greek civilization kept being wiped out by floods and fires and starting over. Solon, who apparently planned to write an epic poem about this, never finished it. He passed the story to a relative named Dropides. Dropides passed it to Critias the elder. Critias the elder told it to Critias the younger, who is the character in Plato's dialogue, as a childhood bedtime story. 4 generations of oral transmission, then Plato writes it down. Is that plausible? And/or is it a fictional chain of custody that Plato invented to give his myth the appearance of authenticity? Here is the uncomfortable answer. We genuinely don't know, and the people who tell you confidently that they do know, in either direction, are not being straight with you. What we can say is this: Solon absolutely existed. He did travel to Egypt. This is confirmed by Herodotus, who is generally reliable on these matters. Egypt absolutely had temple records of extraordinary antiquity. Some Egyptian texts in Plato's time were already 2,000 years old. And the specific city Critias names, Sais, was indeed a center of learning and a city with very ancient roots. So the chain of transmission is not impossible, it is simply unverifiable. Which means the most honest place to start is not, did it happen? But rather, what kind of story is this? And what was Plato actually trying to do with it? Plato was not a journalist, he was a moral philosopher. And when a moral philosopher tells you a story, the story is always doing double duty. Look at what Atlantis actually is in the dialogues. It is an empire. It starts as a just, orderly, divinely founded civilization. Virtuous, moderate, disciplined. Its early kings wear simple wool to judging sessions as a reminder of their mortal origins. They build canals and irrigation systems. They plant forests and manage them sustainably. They hold their oaths sacred. Then, gradually, the divine bloodline, the actual phrase Plato uses, thins. The human portion of their nature swells. And with the shift comes an entirely recognizable list of symptoms. The feasts get longer. The songs praise the king instead of the gods. The laws still exist, but the judges find reasons to bend them. The navy becomes more decorative than functional. The tribute from subject peoples starts to look less like friendship and more like tribute. The kings commission better armor, not because they need it, but because they like how the light plays on it. And then, military expansion, not for defense, for the pleasure of expansion. The maps in the War Council grow outward. Garrisons appear in harbors that had previously been trading partners. The vocabulary of protection slides into the vocabulary of control. Plato, writing in Athens just after its catastrophic imperial overreach in the Peloponnesian War, does not need to name names. Every Athenian reader would feel this. The story of Atlantis is, in this reading, a story about Athens. Not a story about a mythical Western island at all. A story about what Athens had been and what it had become. A story about the specific, identifiable moment when a great civilization stops remembering why it became great and starts simply being great, consuming itself on the memory of its own excellence. But here is the thing that makes this reading incomplete. Plato was too specific. If you want to write a moral fable, you write it vaguely. You write it like Aesop. Animals, no coordinates, no measurements. You do not say the island was 3,000 stadia wide. You do not describe the dimensions of the outer harbour trench, 100 feet wide, 30 feet deep, 600 feet long, in a ring. But you do not name the metal on the wall's orichalcum and describe how it does not tarnish in salt air. You do not say the hot spring temperature was warm enough to soothe muscles at night and the cold spring ran sweet enough to drink without fear. These are not the details of a parable. These are the details of someone who has heard about a real place. The question that haunted ancient commentators and still haunts serious scholars is, which real place? Let us leave Plato for a moment and go somewhere real. The year is approximately 1628 BC, give or take a few decades. The debate about the exact date is still ongoing. In the Aegean Sea, roughly 200 kilometers south of mainland Greece, there is a circular island. It sits at the rim of an ancient volcanic caldera, a massive collapsed magma chamber that last erupted some 180,000 years ago. The island is lush, fertile, and well positioned for trade. It has been inhabited since at least 3000 BC. By the middle of the second millennium BC, it is a prosperous Bronze Age city with frescoed walls, sophisticated plumbing, and ships that cross the entire Mediterranean. The island is called Thera. You know it today as Santorini. What happens on Thera in roughly 1628 BC is one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 10,000 years of Earth's history. Conservative estimates put it at 4 to 6 times more powerful than Krakatoa, which killed 36,000 people in 1883 and darkened skies globally. Some estimates push it higher. The eruption does not simply destroy the island. It ejects approximately 60 cubic kilometers of volcanic material into the atmosphere. It causes what geologists call a caldera collapse. The center of the island literally falls into the emptied magma chamber beneath it, dropping hundreds of meters in seconds and creating a hole in the ocean floor roughly 12 kilometers wide and 400 meters deep. The sea rushes into this hole. The resulting tsunamis, plural, waves in sequence, each worse than the last, are estimated at 9 to 15 meters high when they strike the coastlines of Crete, 110 kilometers away. On Crete at this time is the Minoan civilization, the dominant maritime power of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The Minoans have been sailing, trading, and culturally influencing the entire eastern Mediterranean for nearly 1,000 years. They worship the bull. They build labyrinthine palace complexes. They decorate their walls with frescoes of dolphins and ships. They are wealthy, sophisticated, and naval. After the Thera eruption, the Minoan palace civilization collapses. Not immediately. There are at least 100 years of decline. But the trajectory is clear. The great palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, and Akrotiri are destroyed or abandoned. The Bronze Age network that they anchored fractures. The so-called Bronze Age collapse, which brings down virtually every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean within a century or two of the eruption, may have Thera at its root. Here is what was buried under the ash on Thera. In 1967, a Greek archaeologist named Spiridon Marinatos began excavating a site on the southern tip of Santorini called Akrotiri. What he found, and what excavations have continued to reveal for over 50 years, is remarkable. A complete Bronze Age city preserved under volcanic pumice exactly as Pompeii was later preserved under ash from Vesuvius. Streets, multi-story buildings, sophisticated drainage systems, painted frescoes so vivid that the blue of the sea and the red of the lilies are still bright 3,500 years later. One fresco in particular has transfixed scholars. It is called the Miniature Frieze, and it shows a naval expedition. Multiple ships in formation sailing between two port cities. The cities have multi-story buildings. People watch from rooftops. The composition is so detailed, showing different types of vessels, dock workers, onlookers, even the relative sizes of the buildings, that it is considered one of the most extraordinary surviving artifacts of the Bronze Age. The people of Thera painted their harbour on their walls. They apparently knew they had something worth preserving. They also remarkably had time to leave. Unlike Pompeii, Akrotiri contains no human remains, no skeletons in beds, no bodies in doorways. The inhabitants apparently received enough warning, likely minor eruptions and earthquakes in the days or weeks before the main event, to evacuate with their valuables. The gold and silver are missing. The larger movable objects are gone. The people of Thera left their city and did not come back. Where did they go? We don't know. Into the broader Aegean world, presumably. carrying their culture and their memories of a great circular harbour that had been consumed by fire and sea. Is Thera Atlantis? Not literally. The timeline is all wrong. Thera was destroyed roughly 900 years before Solon visited Egypt, not 9,000 years before. And Thera was inside the Pillars of Hercules, not beyond them as Plato clearly states. But here is the question worth sitting with. If a civilization comparable to Thera's, rich, maritime, built around a harbour, had been destroyed by volcanic catastrophe and the survivors had spread across the Mediterranean carrying the story, what would that story sound like after 900 years of oral transmission? It would sound like Atlantis. The 9,000 years might be a translation error or a deliberate exaggeration. And some scholars have proposed that the Egyptian priests told Solon the number in months, not years, which would bring the timeline to roughly 750 years before Solon, approximately matching the Thera eruption date. It is not a settled debate, it is a deeply interesting one. Let us talk about orichalcum. Plato says the inner walls of Atlantis were clad in a metal called orichalcum, a word that translates roughly from Greek as mountain copper or gold copper. He says it was second only to gold in value. He says it was mined in the mountains of Atlantis and found nowhere else. He says it held its color in salt air, which is a specific and unusual property. Ordinary copper turns green. He says it gave the inner wall the color of live embers at sunset. For a long time, scholars assumed orichalcum was simply a literary invention, a mythical metal for a mythical city, a poetic touch. Then, in 2015, a team of divers working in shallow waters off the coast of Sicily made a discovery. They recovered 39 ingots from an ancient shipwreck, estimated to be from around the 6th century BC, approximately 200 years before Plato was writing. The ingots were oblong, consistent in size, and made of an alloy that laboratory analysis identified as a brass-like mixture of copper, zinc, lead, nickel, and iron. The zinc content was particularly high, around 15 to 20%. This is unusual for ancient metalwork because zinc is notoriously difficult to work with using ancient smelting techniques. Zinc boils at a lower temperature than copper melts, which means that if you try to smelt zinc ore directly, the zinc evaporates before it combines with anything. The only way to make this alloy intentionally is to use a technique called cementation, in which copper is heated in the presence of zinc ore and charcoal, allowing zinc vapors to penetrate the copper before they escape. This is an advanced technique. It is not obvious. Someone figured it out. The result is a metal that is harder than ordinary bronze, has a distinctly golden or reddish gold color, and, critically, is more resistant to corrosion than either pure copper or standard bronze. It would hold its color in salt air. The ingots from the Sicilian wreck were marked with what appeared to be foundry stamps. Someone was producing this alloy at industrial scale. The researchers who published this finding did not claim to have found Atlantis's metal supply chain. They were careful and precise, but they noted that the alloy's properties match Plato's description of orichalcum in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. What this tells us is that Plato was not making up a fictional metal out of whole cloth. He was describing something that existed, a specific, unusual, identifiable alloy that had been in production in the Mediterranean world. Whether that metal came from an island beyond Gibraltar is another question entirely. But the detail is real, and real details in a supposed fiction demand explanation. In 373 BC, when Plato was 54 years old and actively writing philosophy, something happened that every educated Greek knew about. The city of Helike sank into the Gulf of Corinth in a single night. Helike was a prosperous city on the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth, roughly 150 kilometers from Athens. It was the head city of the Achaean League, a powerful confederation of 12 Greek cities. It was wealthy, old, and politically significant. In the winter of 373 BC, a series of earthquake swarms preceded by several days of strange animal behavior. The ancient sources describe rats, snakes, and weasels abandoning the city in columns, heading inland, were followed by a catastrophic earthquake and tsunami. The sea swept inland, the land subsided. Helike and a nearby city called Bura disappeared beneath the surface of the Gulf in a single night. 2,000 soldiers from Sparta and Achaea who had been camped in the vicinity were also killed. Helike did not just flood, it sank. The ground beneath it liquefied and subsided in the earthquake, a process geologists now call liquefaction. When water-saturated soil loses structural integrity and behaves like a liquid, the city dropped and the sea came in over it. For centuries afterward, fishermen and sailors in the Gulf of Corinth reported being able to see the ruins of Helike through clear water when the sea was calm. The bronze statue of Poseidon, the sea god, Atlantis' divine patron, was visible on the seafloor, creating a hazard for fishing nets. Helike was excavated for the first time in the 1990s by archaeologists Dora Katsonopoulou and Stephen Sota. They found it exactly where the ancient sources said it was, buried under river delta silt, not under the sea because the coastline has changed over 2,400 years, but unambiguously there. Plato was 54 when Helike sank. He was in the prime of his intellectual life. He almost certainly knew people who had been there. He would have followed the reports. And 20 years later, he published the story of a great city founded by Poseidon that sank beneath the sea in a single night. This is not evidence that Atlantis is Helike. Helike was in the Gulf of Corinth. Atlantis was supposedly beyond Gibraltar. Helike was a medium-sized city. Atlantis was, according to Plato, larger than Libya and Asia combined. But Helike is evidence of something very important. Plato knew from first-hand cultural memory that cities could sink in a night by the action of an earthquake and a flood. Just as he described, he did not need to invent the mechanism. He had seen it happen. In 2001, a satellite survey of the seafloor off the coast of northwestern Africa identified a submerged bank approximately 60 kilometers west of the Strait of Gibraltar. The bank, called Spartal Bank, sits at a depth of roughly 60 meters today. But at the peak of the last ice age, approximately 18,000 years ago, global sea levels were around 120 meters lower than they are today. At that time, Spartal Bank was an island. A real island, roughly the size of Ireland. A French geologist named Jacques Collina-Girard published a paper in 2001 proposing that this island, which would have been slowly submerging over thousands of years as the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, might be the geological memory behind the Atlantis story. As the island shrank and the Strait of Gibraltar flooded, the Atlantic broke through into the Mediterranean basin catastrophically around 5.33 million years ago. But there were smaller flooding events throughout the Holocene. The people who lived there would have been pushed off their land over generations. Their memory of a larger, richer island, the homeland before the sea took it, would have persisted. By the time that memory reached Egyptian temple records, thousands of years of transmission could have inflated a modest island into a continental superpower. Collina-Girard's hypothesis doesn't fit Plato's timeline either. The Spartal Bank submergence happened before human civilization as we define it, not 9,000 years before Solon. But it demonstrates something important. The geology is real. A real island, in roughly the right location, did disappear beneath the sea. The mechanism Plato describes, earthquake, flood, submergence, describes what actually happens to coastlines in tectonically active regions. The Mediterranean and the Atlantic are both ringed by active fault systems. The Azores, roughly 1,500 kilometers west of Portugal, sit directly on the mid-Atlantic ridge, the boundary between the Eurasian and North American tectonic plates. Volcanic activity there is ongoing. The islands themselves were created by submarine volcanism and could, theoretically, be destroyed by it. In 1755, an earthquake centered near the Azores, the Great Lisbon earthquake, generated a tsunami that killed between 40,000 and 50,000 people, destroyed the city of Lisbon, and sent waves across the entire Atlantic. The shaking was felt in Finland. The Atlantic is not a stable surface. It never has been. Plato's geography, whatever his intentions, is not fiction in terms of what the region is capable of. The mechanism he describes is geologically sound. The only question is the scale and the timing. Let us be honest about the timeline. Plato says Atlantis existed and attacked Greece 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt. Solon visited Egypt around 590 BC. That puts the events of Atlantis at roughly 9,590 BC. 9,590 BC is the Mesolithic period. Human civilization, by which we mean agriculture, cities, writing, metalworking, organized governance, did not exist yet anywhere on Earth. The Neolithic Revolution, when humans shifted from hunting and gathering to farming, began around 10,000 BC in the Fertile Crescent and spread slowly from there. In bronze, technology wasn't developed until roughly 3000 BC. Plato's Atlantis has bronze walls, orichalcum, and even more sophisticated alloy. A ringed harbor of engineered stonework, canal systems, ships, chariots, organized armies, written laws, temples with gold leaf. None of this is possible in 9,590 BC, not anywhere on Earth. This is the number that breaks the literal interpretation beyond repair. Ancient commentators knew this. Crantor, a student at Plato's academy in the generation after Plato's death, reportedly visited Egypt to verify the story and claimed to have found the relevant columns in Sais. But later, ancient writers were skeptical. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing around 7 BC, thought the whole thing was a philosophical fiction. Proclus, writing in the 5th century AD, tried to reconcile the chronology and largely gave up. The most elegant solution to the numbers problem, proposed independently by several modern scholars, is the months hypothesis. In Egyptian priestly calendrical reckoning, months and years were sometimes used interchangeably or confused in translation. If the Egyptian priest told Solon 9,000 seasons, meaning lunar months, and Solon or his descendants understood that as solar years, the actual date would be approximately 750 years before Solon, around 1340 BC. 1340 BC is solidly within the Bronze Age. It is contemporary with the aftermath of the Thera eruption. It is during the height of Minoan and Mycenaean civilization. It is before the Bronze Age collapse. It is, in other words, exactly the period when a great maritime civilization could have been destroyed by volcanic catastrophe and earthquake-generated tsunamis. The numbers problem, far from disproving Atlantis, may simply be pointing to a translation error made by a well-meaning Greek lawgiver who was better at legislation than at Egyptian calendrical notation. Let us look at the engineering. Plato's description of Atlantis's harbor is remarkably specific. 3 concentric rings of seawater alternating with 2 rings of land, all centered on a central hill. The widths are given. The outermost ring of water is 3 stadia wide, approximately 550 meters. The next ring of land 2 stadia, the next ring of water 2 stadia, the innermost ring of land 1 stadium, and the central island 3 stadia in diameter. A canal, 50 stadia long, roughly 9 kilometers, connects the outermost ring to the open sea. The canal is wide enough for a triremes, the standard Greek warship, to pass through. The bridges over the water rings are wide enough for chariots. This is not vague, mystical description. This is an engineer's specification. You could, in theory, build this from Plato's text. And here is the remarkable thing. Concentric harbor structures are not unique to fiction. The harbor of ancient Carthage, the Phoenician city in North Africa that dominated Mediterranean trade from roughly 800 BC to 146 BC, was built with an inner circular harbor for the military fleet surrounding a central island with an outer rectangular harbor for merchant shipping. The inner circular harbor had a diameter of about 325 meters, and with the central island housing the admiral's headquarters, channels connected the inner and outer harbors. The whole complex was designed so that warships could be kept ready without being visible from the sea. This was excavated and confirmed by archaeologists in the 20th century. It matches ancient descriptions with remarkable precision. Carthage was destroyed by Rome in 146 BC, roughly 200 years after Plato wrote. But Carthage had existed at some form since around 814 BC, roughly 250 years before Plato. Greek and Phoenician traders interacted constantly. Plato would have known about Carthage. Did Plato model Atlantis's harbour partly on Carthage? It is not impossible. The concentric water ring design is not identical. Carthage had two harbours, one circular and one rectangular, while Atlantis has multiple concentric rings, but the principle of a circular protected harbour with a central island is the same. There is also the harbour at Rhodes, which was constructed with an elaborate double harbour design, and the harbour at Syracuse in Sicily, which Plato actually visited and knew personally. Plato made at least 3 trips to Sicily, spending significant time at the court of the Syracusan tyrant Dionysius. Plato was not an armchair philosopher who invented harbour designs from scratch. He had seen sophisticated harbours. He knew what engineered maritime infrastructure looked like. The question is not whether Plato's harbour description is plausible. It clearly is. The question is whether he described something real, something he invented, or something in between, a composite portrait of Bronze Age maritime civilization assembled from different sources and dramatized for philosophical effect. In the 1950s, a Columbia University geologist and oceanographer named Marie Tharp began systematically mapping the floor of the Atlantic Ocean using sonar data collected by research ships. What she discovered transformed our understanding of the planet. The Atlantic Ocean floor is not flat. It is not a featureless abyss. It is dominated by the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a continuous underwater mountain range that runs roughly north-south down the center of the Atlantic for approximately 16,000 kilometers. In places, the ridge rises above sea level to form islands: Iceland, the Azores, the islands of Tristan da Cunha. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is the boundary between tectonic plates. The North American plate and the Eurasian plate are moving apart at roughly 2.5 centimeters per year, about the speed your fingernails grow. As they separate, magma wells up from below, creating new oceanic crust. The ridge is, in geological terms, very young and very active. Here is what this means for the Atlantis question. A continent in the middle of the Atlantic is geologically impossible. Continents are made of granite, relatively light rock that floats on the denser mantle below. The Atlantic seafloor is made of basalt, denser oceanic crust continuously being created at the ridge. There is no room in this geology for a continent to have existed and sunk. You cannot sink granite into basalt. This was the decisive scientific finding that ended serious geological discussion of a continental Atlantis. It happened in the 1960s and 1970s as plate tectonics became established science. Ignatius Donnelly's 19th century vision of a sunken Atlantic continent carrying the mother civilization of all humanity is simply incompatible with what the ocean floor looks like. But, and this is important, the geology does not rule out an island. Islands can and do form in tectonically active regions, and they can and do disappear. Volcanic islands in particular are unstable. The entire island of Surtsey, off the coast of Iceland, was created between 1963 and 1967 by underwater volcanic eruption. It is currently eroding. In the geological record of the Canary Islands, which lie roughly 100 kilometers off the northwest African coast, there is evidence of massive flank collapses, events in which a significant portion of a volcanic island falls into the sea in a catastrophic landslide. These events are rare but real, and when they happen, they generate tsunamis of extraordinary size. The Canary Islands are within the range that Plato's description could encompass. The geology of the Atlantic is not a disproof of a catastrophically destroyed island civilization. It is a disproof of a continent. Those are very different things. In Plato's Atlantis, the 10 kings who govern the island and its empire perform a ritual every 5 or 6 years. They come to the central precinct wearing laurel wreaths, armed only with staves. They hunt a bull, specifically a wild bull, one with the strength to break a man's leg, through the sacred grove. No weapons, no nets. Just the 10 kings and the bull. When the bull is caught and killed, its blood is poured over the sacred pillar. the column of orichalcum inscribed with the laws of the realm. The kings then drink wine mixed with the blood and swear their oaths of justice by the blood and by the fire, the night, and Zeus. This ritual is not Greek. The Greeks had bull sacrifice, of course. Most ancient Mediterranean cultures did. But this specific combination of elements, the bull hunt, the law pillar, the blood oath, the wine mixture, the night ceremony, the 10 participating rulers. This is not standard Greek religious practice. It is, however, remarkably similar to Minoan practice. The Minoans, the Bronze Age civilization of Crete, destroyed or severely damaged by the Thera eruption, were intensely bull-focused in their religious life. The famous Minoan bull-leaping frescoes at Knossos show athletes vaulting over the backs of charging bulls, not killing them, but engaging with them in a ritualized athletic confrontation that clearly had religious significance. The bull was not merely a sacrifice animal in Minoan religion, it was a participant. Minoan palace complexes have yielded enormous numbers of bull-head retae, ritual drinking vessels shaped like bulls' heads, used to pour libations. They have yielded horns of consecration, architectural elements shaped like stylized bull horns that appear on altars and at the corners of sacred spaces. And here is the detail that stops serious scholars in their tracks. The Minoan palace at Knossos has been excavated extensively since Arthur Evans began work there in 1900. One of the consistent features of Minoan palace architecture is the maze, not a literal maze, but the complex of corridors and rooms that gave rise to the legend of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. The Greek myth of Theseus, the Athenian prince who killed the Minotaur at the center of the labyrinth in Crete, has long been understood as a cultural memory of the relationship between Athens and the Minoan civilization, perhaps a memory of Athenian submission to Minoan sea power, followed by liberation. If the Minoans were the Atlanteans, or if Minoan civilization was at least one of the primary sources for the Atlantis story, then the Minotaur myth and the Atlantis myth are two different Greek ways of remembering the same underlying reality, a great Bronze Age thalassocracy centered on the Aegean, bites built around bull ritual and maritime power that fell catastrophically. The bull is the thread that connects them. Here is what Plato is actually doing with all of this and why it matters. In the Republic, his most famous work, Plato describes the ideal city-state and also, crucially, the ways in which ideal city-states decay. He identifies a specific sequence: aristocracy, rule by the best; degenerates into timocracy, rule by the honor-seeking, which degenerates into oligarchy, rule by the wealthy, which degenerates into democracy, rule by the many, which degenerates into tyranny. Each stage of decay has a corresponding psychological type. The timocratic man is competitive and honor-obsessed. The oligarchic man is miserly and calculating. The democratic man is pleasure-seeking and inconsistent. The tyrannical man is enslaved to his worst desires. Now look at the arc of Atlantis in the Critias dialogue. The early Atlanteans, the generation of Atlas, are aristocratic in Plato's sense. They rule justly. They value moderation. They wear plain wool as a reminder of their mortality. They repair roads instead of building monuments to themselves. Their wealth is functional. As the generations pass, the divine bloodline thins. The kings become timocratic. Their halls grow longer. Their singers praise them by name. Their hunts become ceremonial rather than genuinely dangerous. Then oligarchic. Wealth begins to pool. Laws are bent for the powerful. The navy becomes decorative. The final stage, the one that brings the gods' judgment, is the pure appetite of the tyrannical soul writ large as imperial policy. Expansion, not for security, but for the pleasure of power. Control not for order, but for control's own sake. Plato is mapping the Republic's theory of political decay onto a historical or quasi-historical narrative. Atlantis is a case study in his political psychology. This is why the story has never been forgotten. Not because it is about a lost city, because it is about a recognizable process. Readers in every subsequent age have looked at Atlantis and seen their own civilization in it. The Romans saw it, the Spanish Empire saw it. The British Empire, at its height, had writers explicitly drawing the comparison. The 20th century's totalitarian experiments generated their own Atlantean readings. Every civilization that has ever achieved significant power has eventually asked, "Are we becoming Atlantis?" This is a different kind of truth from geological truth. It is moral truth. It is the kind of truth that outlasts the evidence for it. And perhaps that is the most interesting thing Plato achieved. He created a story so precisely calibrated to describe the internal decay of powerful societies that it perpetually regenerates. Every generation that reads it recognizes something. Every culture that reaches a certain point of prosperity and expansion meets the story and shivers a little. The island may or may not have existed. The pattern Plato put in it absolutely does. After Plato, Atlantis lived quietly for about 1,800 years. It was debated by philosophers, mentioned occasionally by geographers, cited when people wanted an example of divine punishment for hubris. It did not capture popular imagination in the way it later would. Then came the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. When European sailors crossed the Atlantic in the late 15th and early 16th centuries and found two enormous continents no Greek had ever imagined, something happened to the Atlantis story. It got fuel. Here was a vast, unknown Western Ocean. Here were civilizations, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, with pyramids and sophisticated engineering, and, in the case of the Maya, an advanced writing system. The parallel with Plato's advanced Western civilization was impossible to miss. Francis Bacon, writing in 1627, used the name New Atlantis for his utopian vision of a scientific society. He was not claiming that his fictional Bensalem was the real Atlantis. He was using the name as a symbol, a Western island of advanced civilization, to describe what a rational and science-organized society might look like. But the more ambitious step came in 1882. Ignatius Donnelly, a Minnesota politician who had also written books about Shakespeare's authorship and a theory that a comet caused the biblical flood, published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It became one of the best-selling non-fiction books of the 19th century. Donnelly's argument stated boldly, Atlantis was real. It was a continent in the Atlantic. All world civilizations, Egyptian, Greek, Aztec, Peruvian, West African, are descended from Atlantean colonists. The flood myths found in cultures around the world are memories of Atlantis' destruction. The linguistic and cultural similarities between Old World and New World civilizations are explained by a common Atlantean mother civilization. Donnelly was a gifted writer. His book reads as compelling argument. He marshals enormous amounts of comparative data. He was also, in almost every specific claim, wrong. The linguistic similarities he identifies are superficial and selective. The architectural similarities he draws, pyramids here, pyramids there, ignore the enormous functional and structural differences between Egyptian mastabas, true pyramids, and Mesoamerican step temples. The flood myths are broadly universal, not because they share a common event, but because floods are universal. Every human civilization that lives near water has flood stories because floods are genuinely dangerous and genuinely memorable. More fundamentally, Donnelly published his book in 1882 before plate tectonics was understood. He did not know that a continent cannot simply sink into the ocean. He did not know that the Atlantic seafloor is geologically young and actively forming. He was not stupid. He was working with the best geological knowledge of his time, but his framework, Atlantis as the lost mother civilization, entered popular culture and has never left. It is the default assumption of every documentary, every cable TV special, every internet rabbit hole about Atlantis. And it has nothing to do with what Plato actually wrote. Plato never said Atlantis was a continent. He said it was an island. He never said it was the mother of all civilization. He said it was a powerful empire that attacked Greece and lost. He never said Egyptian civilization, Aztec civilization, or any other civilization was descended from it. He described it as a distinct, contained civilization with a specific location. And Donnelly didn't discover Plato's Atlantis. He invented a different one. The 20th century brought two things to the Atlantis question: better science and worse mythology. The worse mythology first. In the early 20th century, as nationalism and racial pseudoscience rose in Europe, the Atlantis legend was co-opted for genuinely ugly purposes. The Nazis, in particular, had a significant institutional interest in Atlantis. Heinrich Himmler's SS had a research division called the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Organization, that ran genuine expeditions to places including Tibet, Iceland, and South America, looking for evidence of an Aryan master race descended from Atlanteans. This was pseudoscience in service of genocide. It is worth being absolutely clear about this. The Nazi use of Atlantis mythology has nothing to do with the legitimate historical or archaeological inquiry. It was fantasy dressed as scholarship, and it killed people. It also poisoned the serious study of the Atlantis question for decades, because any scholar who engaged with the topic risked being associated with cranks and worse. The better science came from several directions at once. Oceanography, as we've discussed, established definitively that no continent sank in the Atlantic within human history. But it also produced detailed maps of specific features: the mid-ocean ridge, the Azores platform, various submerged banks, that reinvigorated the smaller-scale island hypothesis. Volcanology and geology applied to the Thera/Santorini site produced increasingly refined dates and impact assessments for the Bronze Age eruption. Ice core data from Greenland showed a distinctive volcanic acid layer that has been dated to around 1628 BC, consistent with the Thera eruption date. Tree ring data from ancient trees in North America, Ireland, England, and Sweden all show evidence of a major environmental disruption around the same period. The Bronze Age collapse, the mysterious and still not fully explained simultaneous failure of virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC, became a major field of study. Scholars like Eric Klein have reconstructed a picture of interconnected civilizational stress: drought, earthquake, migration, disrupted trade networks, all hitting simultaneously. The world that the Thera eruption destabilized over the following centuries finally collapsed completely. Into this field, the Thera Atlantis hypothesis fits compellingly. Not as a literal identification, again, the geography doesn't match Plato's text, but as a template for how a devastating Bronze Age catastrophe could have entered oral tradition, traveled through Egypt, reached Solon, and eventually been shaped by Plato into a philosophical narrative. In 2004, a team of geologists studying sediment cores from the seafloor near Santorini published findings suggesting that the Thera eruption may have been even larger than previously estimated. Perhaps 60 to 80 cubic kilometers of material ejected, not the previously accepted 39 cubic kilometers. The tsunami modeling for this larger event suggests waves potentially reaching 35 to 50 meters in height along nearby coastlines. 35 to 50 meters, striking coastal cities, destroying harbor facilities, inundating fields, killing thousands of people with no warning. A civilization that survived such an event would remember it. They would remember the bulls they worshipped, the harbors they built, the metal they used on their ships. They would carry the story with them as they fled to other islands, other coasts. They would tell it to their children, and their children would tell it to theirs. We should talk about the richer structure because it has become one of the most viral Atlantis claims of the 21st century. The Richer structure is a geological formation in the Sahara Desert of Mauritania in Western Africa. From satellite imagery, it looks astonishing, a series of concentric circular rings, roughly 40 kilometers in diameter, clearly visible from space. It looks, at first glance, exactly like someone's diagram of Atlantis's concentric harbor, scaled up enormously. In 2018 and 2019, a YouTube channel called Bright Insight published videos arguing that the Richer structure was Atlantis. The videos went massively viral. One has over 20 million views. The argument? The concentric circles match Plato's description. The location near the Atlantic coast of Africa is consistent with beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and the dimensions, if you assume Plato's measurements are in stadia and adjust them creatively, could work. The videos are compelling. They are also wrong, and the wrongness is instructive. The Risha structure is not concentric rings of water and land. It is a geological dome, a circular uplift caused by magma intruding into sedimentary rock layers that has been eroded over millions of years. The rings are not rings of seawater. They are erosional features in layered rock of different hardnesses, exposed by millions of years of weathering. The structure is in the middle of the Sahara Desert, roughly 500 kilometers from the nearest coastline. Plato's Atlantis was an island surrounded by sea. There is no mechanism by which an island in the Atlantic could have become a land feature in the middle of Africa. The Risha structure has yielded no human artifacts from the relevant period. No Bronze Age pottery, no Bronze Age metalwork, no harbor infrastructure, no evidence of habitation at the scale Plato describes. But the real reason to examine the Risha structure carefully is not the structure itself. It is what it reveals about how we look. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns. It is so good at finding patterns that it finds them in random noise. Psychologists call this apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. We see faces in clouds. We see animal shapes in rock formations. We see significance in coincidence. When we look at the Atlantis question with a strong prior belief, when we want Atlantis to be real, we find evidence for it everywhere. The Risha structure's circles are a perfect example. They look like Atlantis's harbor because our brains are designed to find that kind of pattern. But looking like something is not the same as being it. This is why archaeology is slow and methodical and careful. This is why peer review exists. This is why genuine scholars get so frustrated with popular Atlantis content. Not because they are defensive or closed-minded, but because they have seen how the pattern-matching desire for a lost city has led intelligent people to confidently wrong conclusions over and over again. The standard of evidence for a major Bronze Age civilization is not the satellite image vaguely looks like the description. It is pottery sequences. It is stratified deposits. It is isotope analysis of human remains. It is deciphered texts. It is correlating multiple independent lines of evidence. None of those lines converge on the Risha structure. So where does that leave us? Let us try to be genuinely careful, not dismissive, not credulous, genuinely careful. What we can say with confidence. Plato wrote the only primary source for Atlantis. Full stop. Everything else is derivative, speculative, or fictional. Plato's Atlantis is almost certainly not geologically possible as a literal continent in the Atlantic Ocean. The seafloor science is definitive on this point. Plato's Atlantis contains many details that are recognizably drawn from real Bronze Age Mediterranean cultures. Concentric harbor design, bull ritual, orichalcum-like alloys, 10-king governance structures, maritime empire, the specific kind of moral decay he describes. Real catastrophic events of the kind Plato describes, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis destroying island civilizations, did happen in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The Thera eruption is the most obvious and most thoroughly documented. Real cities within Plato's cultural memory did sink in exactly the way he describes. Helike being the most dramatic example. Plato was a moral philosopher with strong ideas about how and why civilizations decay. The Atlantis story serves his philosophical program with remarkable precision. And what we cannot say Plato simply invented the whole thing. The chain of transmission to Solon and to Egypt is not impossible, and some specific details in the Atlantis description are too unusual to be pure invention. Orichalcum, the specific harbor dimensions, the 10-king governance structure. We cannot say Atlantis was definitely Thera, or definitely Minoan civilization, or definitely any single identified culture. The chronology doesn't match any single candidate well enough. We cannot say the story is pure fiction just because no archaeological site matches it exactly. Fiction built on real-world observation often contains real-world details that archaeology has yet to identify. The honest answer, the answer that respects the evidence without either dismissing or inflating it, is this. Plato wrote a philosophical narrative that drew on genuine cultural memories of Bronze Age catastrophe and civilizational collapse. filtered through Egyptian temple tradition and Greek oral transmission, shaped by his own philosophical project and set in a geographic frame that may have been deliberately exaggerated or may reflect an imperfect translation of an earlier source. The story is true in the way that powerful stories are true. It captures something real about the arc of civilizations, the dangers of prosperity and power, and the speed with which the sea can close over what seemed permanent. Whether there was a real island beneath all that, a specific, locatable place that a future underwater archaeologist might one day map, we genuinely do not know. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Here is the thing about Plato's Atlantis that almost no one talks about. He never finishes the story. Critias breaks off mid-sentence. Zeus has just gathered the gods to address Atlantis's moral corruption. He has not yet spoken. The gods are assembled. The judgment is coming. And then the text simply stops. Some scholars believe the manuscript was never completed. Others believe the third dialogue Plato planned, Hermocrates, which would presumably have described the war in full and the final destruction, was written and then lost. Others believe Plato stopped deliberately, leaving the ending open. There is something extraordinarily powerful about a story that ends at the moment of judgment, with the verdict still unspoken. Because the verdict has never really been delivered. It is still pending. Every civilization that has read the Atlantis story and recognized itself in it has also, implicitly, been asking the same question. Does this have to end the way it ended for them? Is the arc inevitable? Can a civilization reach great wealth and power and maritime influence and not follow the Atlantean trajectory toward moral decline and catastrophic fall? Plato does not answer this question. He sets it up and leaves it on the table. The Atlanteans had everything they needed to avoid their fate. They knew their own laws. They wrote them on the pillar. They gathered every 5th and 6th year specifically to recommit to those laws in the most solemn ceremony they had. They remembered, at least formally, the divine origin of their civilization and their obligation to honor it. They knew. And it still happened slowly, incrementally, imperceptibly, until it was too late. The warm spring ran hot. The cold spring changed taste. The dolphins left the ring harbor. The fish showed strange marks. The earth shook in small jolts that the children laughed at because the cups danced on the tables. And then the night came. This is the detail that makes the story feel less like a lesson and more like a warning. Because the people of Atlantis, as Plato writes them, were not monsters. But they were not stupid. They were us. People who loved their city, who maintained their temples, who drilled their soldiers, who made good wine and ate good food and built beautiful things. People who could not quite see the thing that was building in their own character until it was built. The great virtue of Plato's unfinished ending is that it leaves space for a different conclusion. The verdict is not yet rendered. The judgment has not yet come. There is still time to look at the pillar. There is still time to read what it says. The story of Atlantis has been crossing water for 2,380 years. It started as an Egyptian temple record, or as a philosophical invention, or as both, which is the most likely answer. It was transmitted by a Greek lawgiver who wanted to write an epic poem and never got around to it. It was shaped by a philosopher who was trying to hold a mirror up to his own civilization at the moment of its greatest failure. It was kept alive by medieval mapmakers who filled blank ocean with hope. It was inflated by a 19th century Minnesota politician who wanted one story to explain everything. It was abused by the worst ideology of the 20th century and survived that too. And today, it is still circling on the seafloor maps, in the satellite images of Saharan rock formations, in the ash layers of Greenland ice cores, in the Bronze Age harbour fresco on a wall in Akrotiri that has been waiting under volcanic pumice for 3,600 years. The geologists have told us there is no sunken continent. The archaeologists have told us there is no confirmed site. The text scholars have told us we have one source, and it was written by a philosopher with a clear agenda. And still, the story lives. Not because people are credulous, not because the evidence is secretly compelling, but because the story is doing something that facts cannot do by themselves. It is asking what happens to a civilization that forgets what it was built for. It is asking what the sound is like when a pillar of law falls into darkness. It is asking whether the rings that protected a city can also trap it. These are not questions that oceanography can settle. They are not questions that an excavation can answer, even if someone tomorrow finds the harbor we've all been looking for. They are questions that every city in every age has to answer for itself. The island went down. The story came up. It has been trying to tell us something ever since.